She carried nothing but a small suitcase, an old hymnal, and a heart full of hope. But when she stepped off the train, the man who was supposed to marry her turned away like he'd never written her at all. The sky stretched wide and gray above the little town of Gable's End, where the wind whispered secrets through the dry grass and loose boards of old porches. The train gave a long sigh as it slowed to a stop, its wheels grinding against the tracks like they didn't want to be here either. But she stepped down anyway, holding tightly to a faded brown suitcase and pressing a hymnal to her chest like it could keep her steady. Her name was Liora Mayfield. She wore a plain blue dress that had seen better days and boots too worn for long walks. Her hat was slightly crooked from the wind, and her hair, soft gold like wheat in summer, peeked out from beneath the brim. Her eyes were the kind that looked for the good in people, even when they'd done nothing to deserve it. Liora stood at the edge of the platform, scanning the faces waiting below. There weren't many. A woman carrying a sack of flour. A boy chasing a dog. An old man in suspenders smoking a pipe. But not him. Not Thorne Callahan, the man who had written her letters filled with careful words and polite questions. The man who had sent for her, who had said he needed someone to care for his daughter and maybe, in time, for him too. Liora's heart thudded as she waited. Maybe he was late. Maybe he was shy. But then she saw him. A tall man with broad shoulders stood near the edge of the general store porch. His arms were crossed and his face was hard. He wore a black coat, dusty from work, and his dark hair curled slightly at his collar. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just stared at her like he didn't know what she was doing there. Their eyes met. And then he turned away. No words. No welcome. Nothing. Liora's chest tightened. The wind tugged at her skirt. She stepped off the platform slowly, looking down at her boots, swallowing the sting in her throat. She didn't cry. Not yet. She had traveled for days, over miles of land that had all started to look the same. Her hands were blistered from the rough train benches and her legs ached. But more than anything, her heart hurt. He had changed his mind. Just like that. Liora didn't go after him. She watched him disappear around the corner of the post office, his boots kicking up dust, and then she looked around the quiet town again. Gable's End was smaller than she'd imagined. Fewer houses. Fewer smiles. And a silence that settled over everything like a blanket no one wanted. She sat on her suitcase beside the platform and opened her hymnal. The edges of the pages were soft and smudged from years of turning. Her mama's handwriting was on the inside cover. Sing when it's hardest, Liora. That's when heaven listens closest. She traced the letters with her thumb and closed her eyes for a moment. Then, soft as a breath, she sang. Just one line. Come thou fount of every blessing. Her voice floated gently into the still air. A few people looked up. One man tipped his hat. The boy stopped chasing his dog. Even the wind paused as if it wanted to listen. But Thorne Callahan did not come back. The station master, an old man with white whiskers and kind eyes, came and sat beside her on the bench. You missin' someone? He asked. She shook her head. He's not missing. He just changed his mind. The man grunted. Thorne Callahan's been missin' his heart since his wife died. Buried it right with her, some folks say. Liora didn't answer. I got a spare room out back, the man offered. Ain't much but better than the bench. Liora looked at him, surprised. Thank you. I don't know what I'm going to do. Well, he said, getting to his feet, I reckon you'll figure it out. And somehow she believed she would. That night, Liora sat by a dusty window in a small back room of the station house. She looked out over the quiet town, holding her hymnal close. She had come to marry a man and found herself alone instead. But maybe, just maybe, God had brought her here for something more than a marriage. Maybe he had brought her to bring back music to a town that had forgotten how to sing. And maybe, just maybe, the man who turned away from her would one day turn back. She had come to marry a man, but it was his silent little girl, with tear-filled eyes and tangled hair, who truly needed her most. The sun rose quiet over Gable's End, as if it too was unsure whether the town was ready to wake. Dust shimmered in the golden light. The chapel stood crooked at the edge of the square, its bell tower empty, the door hanging just a little off its hinges. Inside the little station house, Liora Mayfield sat up in bed and hugged her hymnal close. She hadn't slept much. Dreams of home and her mama's gentle voice had come and gone like shadows on the wall. But when morning came, Liora got up anyway. She washed her face in the cold basin, tied her hair back with a faded ribbon, and buttoned her dress as neatly as she could. She wasn't anyone's bride. Not yet. Maybe never. But she was still Liora Mayfield, and she still believed God didn't bring people somewhere by accident. The townsfolk were watching. They didn't mean to stare, but they did. A young woman with a hymnal in her hand and a broken heart in her chest was something rare in a place like this. Some gave her polite nods. Others looked away. But one pair of eyes followed her quietly from behind the post office steps. Big, brown, and filled with something too old for her 6 years, Junia Callahan watched Liora like a deer might watch the wind. Liora saw her just as she reached the mercantile. The little girl stood still as a stone, barefoot, her dress wrinkled and her hair a tangle of curls. She held a ragged doll close to her chest. Her eyes were wide and afraid but curious too. "Hello," Liora said softly, kneeling down. "Are you Junia?" The girl didn't speak. She just blinked and clutched her doll tighter. Liora smiled, not too wide. Not too fast. "I'm Liora. I came here to meet your daddy." Junia's mouth twitched but no sound came. Her small fingers rubbed at the doll's ear like she was trying to rub a worry away. "I like your doll," Liora said gently. "What's her name?" Still nothing. Liora sat on the edge of the wooden stoop and opened her hymnal. "Do you want to hear a song?" she asked. Junia didn't move, but she didn't run away either. So Liora began to sing. "Jesus loves me, this I know." Her voice floated through the still morning air. It was soft but sure, like a warm quilt being pulled over cold shoulders. "For the Bible tells me so." Junia sat down slowly, her eyes locked on Liora's face. "Little ones to him belong." Liora smiled as she sang. Junia's little hand reached out, just barely brushing the edge of the hymnal. It was the first time she had touched someone outside her family in over a year. "They are weak but he is strong." The door creaked. Liora stopped singing. There, in the shadow of the mercantile's doorway, stood Thorne Callahan. His face looked like stone, quiet, unreadable, and carved by years of hard work and harder grief. "What are you doing with my daughter?" he asked, voice low and tense. Junia shrank back like a scared rabbit. Liora stood slowly. "I was singing," she said calmly. She seemed to want to listen. "She doesn't talk," Thorne said. "Not since," he stopped, jaw tight. "It's none of your concern." "It is," Liora said gently. "Because she's why I came." He looked at her sharp now. "I didn't ask you to stay." "You wrote me first," she replied. "And maybe you changed your mind. But your daughter didn't." Thorne's eyes flickered. His hand came down gently on Junia's shoulder. "Let's go, Junie." The girl didn't move. "Junia," he said again, firmer now. Still, she sat frozen beside Liora, her little hand resting on the hymnal. "Please," Liora said, softer than before. "Let her stay a moment longer." She hasn't smiled, but she listened. Thorne looked down at his daughter. Her small fingers curled tighter around the doll. His shoulders slumped just a little, the weight of the world pressing down on them again. He didn't answer. He just turned and walked back into the store. Liora exhaled. Junia stayed where she was, closer now, leaning against her side. And for the first time, Liora let herself believe, really believe, that maybe God had not sent her to Gable's End to marry a man. Maybe he had sent her to help heal a child. Later that day, Reverend Cyrus Bellamy came to find her. He was tall and thin with a kind smile and eyes that had seen sorrow. His hat was bent on one side and his Bible was patched with tape and hope. "I heard you sang out at the platform yesterday," he said. "Heard it brought old man Peabody to tears, and he don't cry unless there's onions involved." Liora smiled just a little. "It's the only thing I know how to do well." "Well," Reverend Bellamy said, "that might just be enough. The chapel's been quiet since Thorne's wife passed. No one sings anymore. The pews are dusty, and the hymnals are full of mice." Liora raised her eyebrows. "Mice?" "Just one, maybe two," he said with a wink. "But they don't know any hymns." She laughed then. Really laughed. And that was how it began. That evening, she stood in the doorway of the chapel, hymnal in hand. The wooden pews groaned with age. The altar was faded, the cross bent slightly. But it was still God's house. And she was still his child. She sang. Not for a crowd. Not for a wedding. Not for a man. But for hope. For healing. And for a little girl with wide, silent eyes who had not run away. The chapel smelled like dust and sorrow, but as she sang beneath its broken rafters, a tiny hand slipped into hers, and a silent promise was made. The old chapel at the edge of Gable's End hadn't heard a hymn in nearly 2 years. Cobwebs draped across the windows like mourning veils. The front pew leaned to one side, and the hymnals were stacked in the back like forgotten treasures. A sparrow had made a nest above the doorway, and the cross above the altar hung crooked, its shadow slanting long in the early light. But Liora Mayfield stood inside, hands trembling just slightly, her hymnal open in front of her. She had asked Reverend Bellamy if she could start cleaning it up. He had smiled wide enough to show the gap in his front teeth and handed her the key with tears in his eyes. "No one sung in here since Thorne's wife passed," he had said. "Maybe it's time." Now Liora stood in the aisle, letting the silence settle around her like an old friend. She cleared her throat. And then she sang, "I need thee every hour, most gracious Lord." Her voice echoed against the empty walls. Not loud, not proud, but gentle, steady, like a stream after long winter silence. As the song floated through the air, a breeze stirred through the broken windows. The dust danced in golden shafts of light, and something deep in the bones of the chapel seemed to shift, just a little. Each morning after that she returned. She brought a rag, a broom, and her voice. By the end of the week, the windows were clear. The pews were scrubbed. The hymnals were laid out row by row. Still no one came. Except her. And one other. It was a Tuesday when Junia Callahan appeared again. She stood in the doorway, bare feet on the steps, doll in her arms. She didn't speak. She didn't move. But her eyes watched every note Liora sang like they were tiny stars in the sky. Liora smiled but didn't stop singing. She simply nodded her head once and turned a page. The next day Junia came closer. The next she sat in the front pew. Then one morning as Liora sang, "It is well with my soul," she felt something warm brush against her fingers. She looked down. Junia had slipped her small hand into Liora's, her eyes wide and wet with tears. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. It was the first time she had touched anyone without flinching since her mama died. Liora finished the hymn with tears in her own eyes. Not tears of sadness. Tears of breakthrough. Later that afternoon Marta Quill stopped by the chapel. Marta was a stout, no-nonsense widow with hands that could churn butter and wrangle children at the same time. She stood at the doorway with a basket of bread and a frown. "You're stirring up dust and feelings, Miss Mayfield," she said. Liora turned from the pulpit, wiping her hands on her skirt. "I thought maybe the town needed both." Marta grunted. "You're not wrong." She walked in slowly, glancing around. "My husband built that pew," she said, pointing. "Used to sit in it every Sunday and fall asleep halfway through the sermon." Liora chuckled. Marta softened. "My boy won't stop talking about how you sing. Says you sound like heaven. I told him don't be foolish, nothing on earth sounds like that. But then I heard you yesterday through the open window." Liora stood still. "I think maybe," Marta added, voice lower now, "you were sent here for more than just Thorne." Leora's heart fluttered. "I think so too." But not everyone was pleased. That evening as she passed by the general store, she overheard voices. "She's stirring up things that don't need stirring da. That Callahan girl's finally gone quiet and peaceful, don't need some singer ripping the bandage off. Thorne's finally steady again. Let the man be." Liora kept walking. She didn't answer. But in her heart, a tiny voice whispered, "Sing when it's hardest, Liora. That's when heaven listens closest." The next morning it rained. Not hard but steady. The kind of rain that seeps into the earth and makes it remember spring. Liora walked through it, her hymnal tucked under her shawl. When she reached the chapel, Junia was already there. Waiting. And beside her, Thorne Callahan. He stood in the corner, arms folded, watching. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. But he didn't leave. Liora opened her hymnal. She sang anyway. The man who hadn't prayed in years found himself kneeling in the dirt, because the little girl who hadn't spoken since her mama died, was burning with fever and calling out for a voice she didn't know she loved. The storm rolled in fast. By nightfall, Gable's End was wrapped in black skies and roaring wind. Thunder cracked across the horizon like the voice of something ancient. Rain poured down hard enough to beat the dust right off the rooftops. The air smelled of wet soil and lightning. Inside a small cabin at the far edge of town, Thorne Callahan sat at the table, staring at a chipped mug of coffee. He hadn't touched it. He hadn't touched anything since Junia started burning up. She lay curled in a pallet near the fire, cheeks flushed, skin pale, sweat running down her brow like tiny rivers. She hadn't spoken in almost 2 years. But now, in the heat of fever, she whispered, over and over again, a name. Not Papa. Not Mama. But something softer. Liora. Thorne's hands shook. Outside the wind howled. He didn't like asking for help. Not since Mary died. Folks had tried to be kind back then, bringing casseroles, stopping by with awkward silences and too many questions. But grief was a cruel fence. And he had built his high. But now his daughter was sick and all he could do was watch. She tossed again, whimpering. Liora. That name again. He didn't know what it meant. Didn't know why Junia whispered it. Didn't realize she had been sneaking off to the chapel each day. That she had sat on those dusty pews and listened to a woman sing the pain out of her heart. But he knew one thing. She wanted Liora. And he'd crawl through fire if that's what his daughter needed. The wind slammed the door as he threw on his coat. The rain hit him like needles, but he didn't stop. He stumbled through the dark streets, soaked to the bone, boots sinking in the muddy path. Every house he passed was shuttered tight. Lamps flickered behind curtains. No one else was out. Except him. He pounded on the back door of the station house. It opened slowly, light spilling out, warm and golden. Liora stood there in a nightdress, a blanket around her shoulders, eyes wide. "Junia," he said, out of breath. "She's sick. Fever. She keeps saying your name." Liora didn't hesitate. She packed herbs and rags and cool water in a tin basin. She wrapped her hymnal in cloth and tucked it beneath her coat. Then she followed Thorne into the storm. The wind fought them all the way. But when they reached the cabin, the fire was still burning, and Junia was still whispering. "Liora." Liora dropped to her knees beside her and gently wiped the sweat from her forehead. She sang softly, not a full hymn, just a hum. Gentle like a lullaby. Like something Mary might have once sung. Thorne watched from the corner, fists clenched. He had been helpless for so long. But tonight, Liora took that helplessness and laid it down like a blanket. She stayed beside Junia all night. At some point the fever broke. Junia's breathing slowed. Her hands stopped twitching. Her skin, though still hot, was no longer burning. Thorne slumped into a chair and covered his face. Liora sat back exhausted. "I've never heard her say a name," he said quietly. "Not since Mary." "I didn't know," Liora replied, her voice almost a whisper. "I didn't want anyone to know," he added, still staring at the fire. "Folks talk. Say I let her slip too far. That she's broken. That it's my fault." "She's not broken," Liora said gently. "She's been holding something too heavy for too long. She just needs someone to help carry it." He looked at her then, really looked. She was soaked, shivering, her hair clinging to her face. Yet her hands still rested on his daughter's brow like they'd always belonged there. "Why'd you stay?" he asked. "You asked me to come," she replied. Not with words, but with need. That night Liora didn't leave. She sat beside Junia's bed until the girl was breathing steady. At dawn the storm had passed. The first pink light of morning painted the sky like a promise. Junia stirred. Liora opened her eyes. The little girl blinked, turned her head, and whispered just once with clarity, "Sing." Liora smiled, tears spilling freely now. She opened her hymnal. And this time Thorne listened too. "'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus." And maybe, just maybe, trust was finally coming back to life. She brought music to a broken town, but when the past came knocking, wearing her husband's old coat, it threatened to silence the only place where she finally felt she belonged. The morning after the fever broke, Gable's end felt different. The air was lighter. The clouds had moved on. And as the first church bell in nearly 2 years rang out from the chapel steeple, folks stopped in their tracks to listen. It wasn't loud. It wasn't perfect. But it was hopeful. The sound floated down Main Street and into kitchens, shops, and tired hearts that had long stopped hoping for anything new. Inside the chapel, Liora Mayfield stood with Junia's small hand tucked into hers. The child had not said much since her fevered whisper, but she hadn't let go of Leora's hand either. And Thorne? He had fixed the bell himself. No one asked him to. But he climbed the old ladder, hammered the rusted bolt, and made sure that when it rang, it could be heard by every grieving soul in Gable's End. By Sunday they came. First it was Marta Quill, dusting off her old Bible with a scowl and a cinnamon bun in her basket. Then it was Silas Beecham, who hadn't worn a clean shirt since his wedding day, limping in with a worn hat pressed against his chest. Even the Thompsons from the mill showed up with their 5 wild children, wriggling on the pews like puppies. The chapel filled slowly, row by row, like a bucket being filled by a slow, steady stream. And when Liora stood before them with her hymnal open, the whole town hushed. She sang, "Come thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace." And hearts began to open. After service, folks lingered. Marta handed out sticky buns and gossip in equal measure. Reverend Bellamy wiped his eyes behind his spectacles. Junia clung to Leora's skirt. And Thorne? He stood back, arms folded, watching, like a man guarding something he hadn't realized was precious until just now. Later that afternoon, Liora sat on the chapel steps, humming while brushing Junia's hair. The little girl didn't speak, but her eyes were brighter. her shoulders less heavy. And when Liora hummed, she hummed along in a whisper, off-key, soft but alive. That was when the letter came. The postmaster, old Mr. Hughes, handed it to Liora with a squint. "Stranger brought this through 2 towns over," he said. "Didn't leave a name. Just said it was for you." Liora opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single page. Scrawled across the paper in a rushed hand were just a few words. "You don't know who he really is." Her heart stopped. No name. No return address. Just a warning. That night, she walked to Thorne's cabin with her lantern shaking in her hand. He met her at the door. "You okay?" he asked. "I need to ask you something," she said, voice low. He stepped aside. Inside, the fire crackled. Junia was asleep in the corner, her doll tucked under one arm. Liora turned toward him. "I got a letter," she said. "Said I don't know who you really are." His jaw tightened. He didn't look surprised. "Do I?" she asked. Thorne didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached under the floorboard of his desk and pulled out a tin box. He opened it. Inside were 2 things. A faded wedding photo of him and Mary, holding baby Junia. And a crumpled telegram. Liora took it. Read. "Thorne Callahan wanted for desertion. 12th Cavalry. Discharged dishonorably. 1879. Her breath caught. "You ran from the army?" she whispered. He nodded, slow and heavy. "I did. My wife was sick. I went home to hold her hand while she died. I never went back. They called it desertion. You never told me." "I never told anyone," he said, voice rough. "But I wasn't going to let her die alone." The room went quiet. Only the crackle of fire, and the tiny sound of Junia breathing. "I came here to marry a good man," Liora said. Thorne's face went hard again. "Then maybe you came to the wrong place." She stared at him. Then knelt by Junia and covered her with a blanket. "No," she said gently. "I think I came to the only place that still needed me." She left the cabin that night, unsure of everything, except one thing. Even broken people could belong. Even a man with a stained past could build something holy again. They came looking for the man with a past, but found a little girl singing again, and a town that finally had something worth protecting. The next Sunday was colder. A wind had slipped down from the mountains, curling around Gable's end like fingers looking for cracks in the walls. Smoke curled from chimneys. Boots stamped against frostbitten ground. But inside the chapel it was warm. Not because of the stove, it barely worked, but because Junia Callahan, for the first time in her life, stood beside Liora and hummed along with the hymns. She didn't say words. Not yet. But she was humming. And for a child who once lived in silence, that sound was thunderous. Folks smiled as they passed. Some cried. Marta wept right into her lace gloves and didn't even bother hiding it. Thorne sat in the back row, head bowed. He hadn't stepped out of the shadows much, but this morning he showed up. And that meant something. That afternoon everything changed. A rider came into town, long coat, hard eyes, dust-covered horse. He didn't smile. Didn't say his name. Just nailed a notice to the front of the general store. Wanted, Thorne Callahan. Desertion. The impersonation of a federal officer. Reward for information. And just like that, the old whispers returned. They slithered through windows and across porches. Thought he was clean. Didn't know it was that bad. What else has he lied about? He's hiding behind that preacher woman. Liora found out from Marta, who marched up the hill with the notice in her apron pocket and fire in her steps. "I don't believe a word of it," she said. Liora read it once. Then again. Her hands didn't shake. Her face didn't flinch. But her heart cracked. Because Junia, that little girl, had just started healing. And the world wanted to take her father away. That night, she went to the cabin again. Thorne didn't make her knock. He was already sitting on the porch, lantern lit beside him, eyes dark and quiet. "You saw it," he said. "I did." "And?" She didn't answer right away. Then she sat beside him. "Did you steal anything?" "No." "Impersonate anyone?" "No." "But you did desert." "I left my post," he said slowly, "because the doctor said Mary had a week left. I rode 4 days straight to get to her. Held her while she died. She begged me not to go back. So I didn't." "And they came for you?" "Twice. I hid." Junia was barely walking. "I couldn't leave her." Liora looked out at the stars. Then closed her eyes. "Faith isn't about perfect men," she whispered. "It's about standing with the broken ones when no one else will." The next morning, Liora did something no one expected. She walked to the front of the chapel, held up the wanted poster. and read it aloud. "This man," she said, her voice clear, "is the same man who built the new bell pull with his bare hands. Who sat up 3 nights with his sick daughter. Who hasn't asked for pity. Who has carried shame like a stone around his neck." Silence. Then Marta stood. "My boy wouldn't sleep, till Thorne came and fixed our fence." Then Silas. "He gave me his last coin to bury my wife when the railroad pulled out." Then the Thompsons. "He carved my son's first slingshot. Wouldn't even take pie for it." One by one they stood. Not because Thorne was perfect, but because they weren't either. But the man in the long coat didn't care about stories. He came back the next day with a marshal's badge. "This isn't a town vote," he growled. "This is federal business." Liora stood in front of Thorne, chin high. "And this is a chapel," she said. "You'll have to take it up with God." The marshal sneered. But just then, a sound stopped him. A tiny, shaking voice from behind the pews. "Papa?" Junia stepped out, barefoot, her voice trembling, but loud. "Don't go." And then she ran to him. Threw her arms around his waist. Held him like he was the only tree in the storm. Even the marshal paused. He looked at the child. At the people standing in the aisle. Then at the hymnals laid open to "He hideth my soul." He took off his hat. And walked out the door. The chapel sat silent. Then Marta muttered, "I hope he gets a flat tire." Nobody knew what that meant, but everyone laughed. And Liora? She sat on the steps afterward with Thorne beside her and Junia curled between them like a promise made new. She didn't speak. She just sang. Softly. Like a mother might. Like a wife would. The little girl who once lived in silence stood before a full chapel, opened her mouth, and gave a broken man and his bride the words they'd been too afraid to say themselves. Spring slipped in slowly, like a prayer whispered through an open window. The snow melted into the thirsty ground, and the brown hills turned green at their edges. The chapel's bell no longer hung silent. Every Sunday it rang, clear, strong and steady. And every Sunday more chairs were filled. Gable's End hadn't known revival in a long time. But they were seeing one now. Not with thunder or grand speeches, but with quiet things. Like Marta bringing extra biscuits. Like Silas showing up early to light the stove. Like Junia's laugh, still rare, still soft but real. And at the center of it all was Liora. She had never asked to lead. She wasn't ordained. But when she sang, the whole town listened. Not just because of the music but because of what they saw in her eyes. Hope. Steadiness. The kind of love that doesn't flinch when life gets messy. One morning, Reverend Bellamy approached her after the service. He cleared his throat twice then said, "Miss Mayfield, I wonder if you'd consider leading next Sunday's service. Start to finish." Liora blinked. "Me?" He nodded. "The people listen to you. Maybe that's the Lord's doing. Maybe he's giving them back something they lost." She swallowed. "I'm not a preacher." "No, you're a healer," he said with a smile. "And right now, this town needs healing more than sermons." All week she prepared. She read through scripture and scribbled notes in the margins. She ironed her best dress and tied her worn hymnal with a blue ribbon. But even more than preparing for the service, she was preparing for something deeper. Because every day Thorne lingered longer after chapel. He helped carry benches. He stayed for supper. He even started walking Junia to the creek and letting her throw stones into the water. He didn't say it out loud. But something was changing. And it scared him more than the law ever did. That Saturday, Liora found him in the garden, fixing a busted fence post. She stood at the edge of the field, fingers tight around her hymnal. "Thorne," she said, "can I ask you something?" He looked up, sweaty and dirt-streaked but attentive. "If Mary were here, would she still be the only one who had your heart?" He froze. Wiped his hands on his pants. "She was the first person who ever loved me for who I was," he said slowly. "But I think, if she could see you with Junia, she'd say you were the first person to love us both for who we're becoming." Liora's throat tightened. She looked down at her hands. "I don't want to replace her." "You don't," he said. "You repair things she didn't get the time to." And that's when Junia ran up, cheeks flushed, wildflowers in her fists. She thrust them toward Liora. "For you," she said. Clear, soft, but full. Liora dropped to her knees. "Junia, you said a full sentence." Junia smiled. Then looked at Thorne. "Papa," she said, "I love her." Thorne knelt beside them both, his arms folding around his daughter and this woman he hadn't dared to hope for. And in the middle of the field, something like forever bloomed. The next morning, the chapel was so full they had to open the side windows to let in more air. Folks packed the pews standing along the walls. Marta brought cushions for the front row. Even the Thompsons brought quiet for once. Liora stepped to the front, holding nothing but her hymnal and a page of handwritten scripture. She opened with a verse. He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds. Psalm 147 verse 3. Then she began to sing. Not loud, not proud, just honest. The same way she'd always sung to the empty chapel, to Junia, to the memories inside Thorne's grief. Her voice wrapped around the walls like a warm quilt. And halfway through the last hymn, a small voice joined hers. Junia. Singing from the front pew. Eyes bright. Voice strong. The whole room stopped breathing. And when the final amen rang out, it was Junia who whispered at last. As if she understood finally what love sounded like. He finally said the words she'd been waiting to hear, but the letter in her hands might take her away from him forever. The day after Junia sang in chapel, the town couldn't stop talking. Every porch, every store, every dinner table, it all came back to the same moment. Did you hear that, child? She sang like an angel. She said amen. She said it like she meant it. Liora walked through Gable's End with a strange stillness in her chest. Like her heart had slowed down, not because it was empty but because it was finally full. Full of music. Full of Junia's laughter. Full of something she hadn't dared name out loud. Love. Not just love for the town. But for the man with the scar above his right brow. The man who watched her without speaking but always heard her. The man who, that very night, came to her door and knocked, not out of duty but out of hope. She opened the door and found Thorne standing there, hat in hand. His shirt was clean. His boots were muddy. And his voice was shaking. Can we walk? He asked. They walked in silence for a while, down the path that led past the creek where Junia liked to toss stones. The wind was gentle. Birdsong floated around them like background music to something neither of them wanted to rush. Then he stopped, turned to her. I don't know how to say this the right way, he began. But when you first came here, I didn't want you. She smiled a little. I noticed. I didn't believe the Lord would send anyone worth loving to a man like me. A man who's run. A man who's failed. A man who's buried his past and still hears it knock every night. Leora's breath caught. But then you stood by me, he said. Even when the law came. Even when the truth came out. He stepped closer. You sang this town back to life. You gave my daughter her voice. You gave me my hope back. She swallowed. And then he said it. I love you, Liora. Her eyes filled. Slowly. Quietly. But wholly. I love you too, she whispered. He took her hand. Rough and calloused. Steady and warm. And right there by the creek, under the setting sun and the sighing trees, he kissed her. No thunder. No music. Just peace. The next morning, everything felt different. Lighter. Brighter. Liora braided Junia's hair with flowers and hummed while she swept the chapel floor. And that's when the letter came. Marta found it at the post office and brought it up the hill, waving it like it was something exciting. It's from Cincinnati, she said. That fancy music school you always dreamed about? Liora blinked. Took the envelope. Her hands trembled before she opened it. She read it twice. Then sat down hard on the chapel steps. The Jubilee School for Young Women's Music and Voice. We are pleased to offer you a teaching position beginning this summer. Room, board, and full salary provided. We believe your talent belongs on a larger stage. Please reply within 14 days. Junia came out, blinking in the sunlight. She curled up next to Liora and leaned her head against her shoulder. Thorne arrived minutes later, carrying a fresh sawed stack of firewood. He saw the letter in her hands. Saw her face. And stopped cold. What is it? He asked. She handed it to him. He read it slowly. Then nodded. That's the dream, he said. Liora looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. It was. Silence. Then. I'd be proud of you, Thorne said. Even if you chose it. Leora's voice broke. But you're the first thing I ever loved that wasn't just about me. He didn't answer. He just looked at Junia, now humming on the chapel step, tracing a flower petal across her bare toes. Then looked back at Liora. You'd break her heart, he said. But I wouldn't stop you. That night, Liora lay awake in her bed. She looked at her worn hymnal on the windowsill. At the dried flowers from Junia beside it. At the sky, clear and dark and wide. And she asked the question she hadn't dared ask in years. God, what do you want me to do? She stepped up to say goodbye, but when the music started, the words in her heart found a new ending. The letter sat on the chapel desk for 4 days. Unanswered. Unmoved. Unopened again but never unread. Liora touched the edges of the envelope like it could burn her. And in a way it had. Because now she knew what she had once wanted most, no longer felt whole without them. Without Thorne. Without Junia. Without the crooked pews and chipped hymnals and the town that had somehow, without asking, become hers. But people talked. They'd seen Marta carry the letter. They'd heard bits of news. The Jubilee School wasn't some wandering salesman's promise. It was real. Fancy. But you'll go, won't you? Marta asked, voice hopeful but sad. I don't know, Liora said honestly. You've got a gift. A big one. She looked out at the chapel walls. I just never knew my gift might be needed more in a place this small. Thorne didn't ask again. But each night he and Junia walked Liora home. They didn't say it, but their eyes asked the question their mouths couldn't. Will you stay? And each time she just smiled and said, good night. But inside, she was breaking. Because both roads led to heartache. And she wasn't sure which one would cost more. On Sunday the chapel was full again. Word had spread, Liora Mayfield would be singing one last time before her decision. They came in boots, bonnets, shawls and silence. Even folks from 2 towns over rode in on carts. Some brought pies. Some brought Bibles. All brought their hopes. Liora stood at the front, her hymnal pressed to her chest. Thorne sat beside Junia in the second pew. His hat was off. His eyes were steady. But his jaw clenched, like holding back something he couldn't say aloud. She opened the service with prayer, then read from Proverbs. In their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. Proverbs 16 verse 9. Then she looked at the paper tucked inside her hymnal. And slowly tore it in half. Gasps echoed. She smiled, soft and sure. I wrote a reply last night, she said. I told them thank you. But I've already found the stage God set for me, and it's here. Junia jumped from the pew and ran up the aisle, straight into her arms. The whole room stood. Tears ran freely. Silas wiped his face with his sleeve. Even old Mrs. Bensley, who hadn't cried since the gold dried up, had misty glasses. But Thorne? He just rose slowly, walked forward, pulled a small carved wooden box from his coat pocket. And in front of the town, the child and the woman who sang him back to life. He knelt. I carved it from the tree Junia first spoke under, he said. It's not gold, but it's real. He opened the lid. Inside was a simple band, made of twisted copper and warm maple wood. Liora Mayfield, he said, voice thick, will you stay, forever? She didn't cry. She laughed, a bright, trembling sound that rang like a hymn. Yes, she said. Yes, I will. The chapel burst into clapping, cheers and hallelujahs. Someone started singing. Someone else joined in. And Liora? She stood in the middle of it all, ring on her hand, child in her arms, groom at her side. And she sang. Because she was home. Not because it was what she planned. But because it was exactly what her heart had been waiting for. 2 hearts joined in faith, a new life whispered into the world, and a small town song that will echo long after the last note fades. Spring was bursting everywhere. The creek sparkled in the sunlight, carrying the stories of the town down to the river. The wildflowers carpeted the fields, bluebells, daisies and soft purple lupin bending with the breeze. Gable's End smelled like fresh earth and hope. And on this day it smelled like joy. The chapel was ready. Freshly swept, polished, and filled with flowers Martha had picked from her garden. The wooden pews held more people than they had in years. Farmers, shopkeepers, children with sticky hands, even the shy new faces from the railroad camps. Every eye turned toward the front where Liora stood, radiant in a simple white dress stitched by Marta. Her hymnal was tied with a ribbon, this time a soft gold. Junia sat nearby wearing a little blue dress, her curls tied back with a matching bow. Thorne waited at the altar, his rough hands nervously adjusting his tie. He caught Leora's eye. She smiled. It was a smile full of promises, of love, of faith, of forever. The service began quietly, with Reverend Bellamy reading from the Book of Ruth. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God my God. Leora's voice rose with the first hymn, clear and strong. Junia's eyes shone as she listened. Around them, the town sang, lifting their voices to the sky, to the God who had woven their lives together in ways no one could have planned. When it came time for vows, Thorne spoke first. His voice was steady but soft. Liora Mayfield, you came to Gable's End carrying a song in your heart, and healed a town, a child, and a man who thought he'd lost everything. I vow to stand beside you, to hold your hand through every storm, and to be the home you need when the world feels cold. Leora's eyes filled. She spoke with a calm fierceness. "Thorne Callahan, you showed me what faith looks like, gritty, patient, and true. I vow to walk beside you, to sing with you through joy and sorrow, and to love you for all the days God gives us." Junia clapped softly, breaking the stillness, and the chapel burst into laughter and tears. When the rings were exchanged, the simple copper and wood band, everyone felt the weight of the moment. A promise made plain and true. Later that evening, the town gathered on the hill behind the chapel for the reception. Long tables groaned under pies, roasted chicken, and fresh bread. Children ran barefoot in the grass. The sky blazed pink and orange as the sun dipped low. Liora and Thorne sat side by side, hands intertwined, watching Junia chase fireflies. Months passed. The seasons turned. One cold winter night, with the snow drifting silently outside the cabin window, Liora held a tiny bundle close. Junia was there, wide-eyed and amazed at the new life. A son. They named him Elias, which meant, "The Lord is my God." Elias's first cry was like a hymn filling the quiet room. Thorne kissed Leora's forehead. Tears slid down her cheek, not just for the new life in her arms, but for the journey that had brought them here. The broken pieces of their pasts had been woven into a tapestry more beautiful than either could have imagined. Years later, Gable's end still sang. Junia's voice grew stronger every day. Thorne worked the land beside his family. And Liora taught music to the children of the town, her hymns echoing in every heart. Their story became part of the town's quiet legend. A story of faith, second chances, and the kind of love that never lets go. And if you've listened this far, maybe you believe it too. That love, like a hymn, can heal even the quietest hearts. That faith can build a home from broken pieces. And that sometimes, the greatest songs are the ones sung in the smallest places. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe. Your support helps bring more heartfelt tales like this to life. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time, may your days be full of hope, your nights full of peace, and your heart full of song.